I mended the cracks in her armor, then the alien woman smiled. I owe you, human. The armor came to Callum Voss in 3 pieces, wrapped in black cloth and delivered without a word by a figure who vanished before he could ask a single question. He set the bundle on his workbench at the far end of berth 7, unwrapped it slowly, and stared at what was inside for a long time. He'd worked on a lot of things in 14 years as a materials specialist and independent armorite. Station plating, ship hulls, pressure suits, ceremonial regalia for 3 different planetary courts, field-rated combat chassis for Terran Alliance Marines. He'd repaired things that had been shot through, melted, crushed, and in one memorable case partially digested by a silicon-based life form on a methane world. He thought he'd seen most of what damage could look like. He hadn't seen anything like this. The armor was Cathari work. He knew it the moment he touched it, the layered construction, the specific way the stress-routing channels were embedded in the composite, the faint iridescent quality to the material that no human manufacturer had successfully replicated. Cathari armor was grown as much as it was made, seeded in mineral baths and allowed to crystallize over months according to patterns that the Cathari considered proprietary information, and which they had never shared with anyone outside their own caste. The result was something between metal and ceramic, and something else that didn't have a human name yet, and it held up to punishment in ways that defied what the material looked like it should be able to do. This set had held up to quite a lot of punishment, and it had paid the price. The main chest piece was cracked in 4 places, 2 of them clean fractures that went all the way through, and 2 that were partial, the kind that looked stable until they weren't. The right pauldron had a section roughly the size of Callum's palm that was simply missing, sheared off cleanly, and the edges of the break were scorched in a way he recognized from transit ambush damage reports. Directed energy, close range, at an angle that suggested the wearer had been turning toward it when it hit. The left vambrace had taken impact damage, maybe from the floor, maybe from debris. It wasn't cracked, but the stress channel lattice underneath was deformed, which meant it wouldn't distribute force correctly under load. The way the deformation ran, the whole forearm piece would fail catastrophically under a hard block. In other words, the set looked intact enough to pass a visual inspection at distance, but any actual combat use would be dangerous. In some ways, that was worse than armor that obviously needed replacing. The black cloth the armor had been wrapped in was fine quality, finely woven, the kind used for presentation and ceremony. Whatever this armor was for, it wasn't everyday use, and whatever had happened to it hadn't been a controlled training exercise. Callum pulled his assessment light and got to work. He was still working when the owner arrived. He heard her before he saw her. The berth's main access door opened, and he registered the footsteps, deliberate, even-spaced, the kind that came from someone who was used to moving quietly and choosing not to write now. A statement of a kind. He didn't look up from the vambrace he was examining. He had a stress channel deviation he was trying to quantify, and interrupting that kind of focus cost time he didn't want to spend. You are the human who works with materials. It wasn't a question. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. The tone was precise, stripped of anything unnecessary. He'd heard that register before from diplomatic corps personnel and senior military officers, people who'd trained themselves to communicate in the most efficient form possible because attention was a limited resource. "That's me," he said, still not looking up. "Give me 30 seconds. Silence. He finished his measurement, saved the reading, set down the scanner, and looked up. She was tall. Cathari ran tall compared to humans in general, but she was tall even by that standard, and she was standing very straight, which made her seem taller still. Her skin was the deep amber bronze that he associated with the Cathari blade sworn specifically. The coloring was apparently a mark of the caste, something to do with the mineral compounds in their food regimen during training. Her hair was black with an almost structural quality to it, cropped close on the sides and longer on top, held back from her face. Her eyes were striking, pale gold irises with a narrow dark ring at the outer edge, the kind of color that looked like it should be warm but wasn't. They were sharp, appraising, and currently doing a very thorough assessment of him. She was in traveling dress rather than armor, which made sense given that the armor was on his workbench. The clothes were severe and well-made, dark colors, nothing that announced itself. She had the build of someone who trained constantly, not simply fit but specifically built, the kind of muscle that developed from years of weighted movement rather than hours on a gym floor. He noticed she was doing exactly what he'd done when the armor arrived, looking without giving anything away. "You've examined the pieces," she said. "Yes." "What is your assessment?" He considered the most efficient way to answer this. 4 active fractures in the chest piece, 2 through and through, 2 partial that'll propagate under load. The right pauldron has lost a section. The break edge tells me directed energy at close range, probably within 3 meters. The left vambrace looks fine, but the stress channel lattice underneath is deformed. It'll fail under a hard block or a lateral impact above a certain force threshold. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did, a slight tightening that he would have missed if he hadn't been paying close attention. You could tell all of that from examination alone. Yes. Without access to the Cathari technical specifications. "I don't have access to your technical specifications," he said. "I read damage. The material tells you what happened to it if you know how to listen." She looked at him for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "Can you repair it?" Not a question again. He couldn't quite tell if that was because she already knew the answer or because she was asking something that was too important to frame as uncertain. "I can repair the fractures and the lattice deformation," he said. "The missing section of the pauldron I can fill with the closest structural match I have in stock. It won't be a perfect materials match, but I can engineer the fill to perform correctly under the stresses the original section would have managed. If you're asking whether the repaired set will be safe to wear into combat or high-stress ceremonial use, yes. If you're asking whether it'll be identical to the original, no. A trained eye will see the repair." That last part mattered. He'd learned over the years that the people who came to him for this kind of work didn't always want to hear it, but they needed to. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she said, "The ceremony is in 31 hours. He did the math without moving. "What's the nature of the ceremony?" "I will be required to stand in full formal arms for 6 hours. There may be a formal challenge." A formal challenge meant combat. What does a formal challenge involve? 3 exchanges. Ceremonial rules, not battlefield rules. Force is controlled but real. The challenge can be directed at the guarded party or directly at the blade sworn. He looked at the armor, then back at her. "I can do this in 20 hours if I start now and have everything I need in stock. That gives you 11 hours margin. You require payment." "I require materials cost in half my standard rate for the labor, the other half when I verify the fit." He paused. "I also require honest answers to technical questions if I hit something I can't solve from examination alone. Some aspects of Cathari construction are things I haven't worked on before, and I won't guess." Another long look. Most craftspeople who work with foreign materials guess rather than admit ignorance. "I know," he said. "That's why their repairs fail." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of her face rearranged itself just enough that he registered it as distinct from what had been there before. "I will answer what I am able to answer," she said. "Some information is caste-restricted. I'll work with what you can give me. Tell me your name." A fractional pause. "Sarathi Vel, blade sworn to the 3rd House of Keth." "Callum Voss." He turned back to the workbench. "Pull up a chair. This is going to take a while, and I'll have questions." She didn't sit in the chair he'd indicated. She stood, slightly to his left and back enough that she wasn't in his working space, and she watched. He was aware of her watching, and he didn't mind it. He'd worked under observation before, and people who watched while he worked were usually the ones who took the repair seriously. He started with the through fractures in the chest piece, because those were the most structurally critical, and because understanding how they'd propagated would tell him things he needed to know about the material's stress behavior before he touched anything else. The fractures run in a particular direction, he said, not looking up, against the grain of the crystalline structure, not with it. Usually in impact damage, fractures follow the grain because that's the path of least resistance. The fact that these ran against it means the force input was extremely high and fast, faster than the material's stress response could redirect. The Heth grade breach charge, she said, her voice was level, at close range. He filed that away. How close? Approximately 2 meters. I was moving when it detonated. If I had been stationary, the chest piece would not have held at all. He looked at the through fractures with new information. She'd been moving away from the detonation point, which had changed the angle of force absorption enough that the material had held instead of shattering. Fast decision, right direction. He didn't say any of that. It wasn't relevant to the repair, but he noted it. The grain direction in the chest composite, he said. I need to understand how it's oriented at the fracture edge before I apply the fill compound, or the repair won't bond correctly. Can you tell me anything about how the layering is structured? A pause. The layers alternate. Compression-oriented, then tension-oriented, then compression. Each layer is approximately 2 millimeters. Alternating orthogonal. Yes. That told him a great deal about how to approach the repair. He got to work. The hours moved the way they did when he was properly focused, not fast, not slow, but with a kind of compressed texture that meant he was only aware of the task immediately in front of him. He worked with a set of compound applicators he'd modified himself, tools he'd built to apply bonding material at a precision that off-the-shelf equipment couldn't match. He spoke when he had questions. Sarathi answered what she could and told him clearly when something was cast-restricted. It was, he thought, a remarkably efficient exchange for 2 people who had never met before that afternoon. At some point she did sit down. He didn't mark exactly when, he registered it peripherally, a shift in his awareness of where she was in the room. She sat with her hands resting on her knees, her back straight, watching him work with an attention that wasn't aggressive but was completely steady. He worked through the first full pass of compound application on the through fractures, taking his time with each line, building up in layers the way the alternating composite structure demanded. The compound he used wasn't Cathari-sourced. He didn't have access to anything like that, but he developed a proprietary formulation over several years that keyed its bonding behavior to the substrate's own crystalline grain. It worked differently on different materials, which was the point. The compound adapted to what it was touching instead of imposing its own structure on the bond. He'd explained this to a Terran Alliance materials inspector once, who had nodded politely and clearly not understood what he was describing. He didn't explain it to Sarathi. After perhaps 3 hours, she said, without any particular preamble, "How did you come to work with alien materials?" Standard human answer or honest answer. A brief pause. Honest. I spent 5 years working for a Terran Alliance defense contractor doing hull plating repair. I was good at it, and I was bored. Standard human armor and hull material has about 30 variables. Once you understand them, you've understood them, and the rest is execution. I took a contract doing repair work on a Vothran station, which was supposed to be 3 months, and turned into 14, because the Vothran insisted on watching everything I did to their materials and asking questions, and I insisted on asking questions back. He applied a precise line of compound along the smaller of the partial fractures. By the end of 14 months, I understood Vothran composite construction well enough to teach it, and I'd started on Drevathi ceramics on the side. Foreign materials have more variables, more interesting. You said the standard human answer, and then gave the honest answer anyway. The standard human answer would have been something about the opportunity for cross-cultural exchange, he said. Which is also true, but it's not why I did it. She was quiet for a moment. The Cathari do not permit humans to study our construction methods. I know. Yet you can assess and repair this work. I'm not working from your methods. I'm working from what I can observe and measure and from what you tell me when I ask. He paused. That's a different thing. Another silence. He thought she was considering that. It is, she said finally. He finished the first compound layer and set the chest piece under the curring frame. The compound needed 20 minutes at a controlled temperature before he could apply the next pass. He used the time to start the assessment work on the right pauldron's broken edge, cleaning it back to clean material and measuring the missing section's footprint precisely. The ceremony tomorrow, he said, not looking up from his measurements. Is it common for a blade-sworn to attend a diplomatic function without her house's armorer present? No, she said. He waited. The circumstances were atypical, she said. The ceremony was moved forward at the host delegation's request. My house armorer is traveling with the primary delegation, which arrived by a different route. I came with the advance party. And the ambush was between your departure point and this station. Yes. He looked at the pauldron edge. The clean shear of the missing section was distinctive. Directed energy at close range left a specific kind of cut, not jagged, not compression fractured, but almost surgical in its cleanliness. Someone had known what they were shooting at and had aimed for the most replaceable-looking section of the right pauldron, the part most likely to be overlooked in a quick visual assessment. This was targeted, he said. The shot that took the pauldron section. Someone knew what the armor looked like well enough to aim for the piece most likely to be dismissed as cosmetic damage. A pause that had a different weight to it than the others she'd given him. Yes, she said. He didn't press on that. It wasn't his business. He returned to his measurements. You are not going to ask, she said. It's not relevant to the repair. Another pause. Most people would consider it relevant to their personal safety, being in proximity to someone who was ambushed. I'm on a station with about 800 people on it, he said. Whoever ambushed your party is either still out there on the transit lane, or they've docked here, or they've moved on. My knowing which one doesn't change any of those options. She seemed to consider this. That is a very practical position. I'm a practical person. You are, she said. It sounded like something she was confirming to herself as much as saying to him. You are also not frightened. Should I be? Most humans in your position would be uncertain, at minimum. He set down his measurement tool and looked at her for a moment. The armor is on my bench and you're in my berth, and the repair needs doing, he said. I don't see how being frightened helps any of those things. The quality around her eyes shifted again. No, she said, it does not. He went back to work. He found the first unexpected problem at hour 6. A hairline fracture in the interior surface of the chest piece that his initial scan had missed, because it was running parallel to a stress channel, and the scanner had interpreted them as the same feature. He stopped and looked at it under magnification for a long time. There's a hairline fracture on the interior surface, he said, running parallel to the central stress channel. I missed it in the initial scan. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, where exactly? He described the location in spatial terms, and she came over to look, standing close enough to the bench that he was aware of the slight warmth of her. She looked at where he was pointing. That fracture was there before the ambush, she said, very quietly. He glanced at her. Her expression was carefully controlled in a way that told him it was being controlled. Old damage, A formal challenge 7 years ago. I was not, she paused. I did not manage the strike correctly. The impact force propagated inward instead of being redirected along the channel. I was told the interior surface had absorbed it cleanly. I was apparently told incorrectly. He looked at the fracture again. 7 years. The armor had been load-bearing for 7 years with that fracture in it. Cathari construction was impressive, he thought, but it was also the case that Sarathi Vel had been carrying a quiet structural failure for 7 years without knowing. It can be repaired, he said. The technique is the same as the through fractures. It'll take an extra 2 hours. You still have adequate margin. Yes, he paused. You should know so that next time you have the armor inspected. There was no protocol to inspect the interior surface of the chest piece without removing the lining, she said. The lining removal requires a specialized tool that belongs to my house armorer. He is on Keth. I can show you a method for doing it with general equipment. She looked at him. That look again, the sharp, appraising gold eyes. Why? Because a hidden fracture on the interior of a chest piece is the kind of thing that will eventually fail at a moment you can't afford, he said. Knowing it's there is better than not knowing. A long pause. Then, carefully, the Cathari do not generally teach their maintenance protocols to outsiders. I'm not asking you to teach me your maintenance protocols. I'm offering to show you how to check a specific thing that your current protocol misses. She was quiet. He went back to work on the hairline fracture, giving her time to think. Show me when you are finished with that repair, she said finally. I will. He spent another 40 minutes on the hairline fracture, working in careful layers, each one thinner than the last as he built up from the deepest point of the crack outward. When he was satisfied with the depth fill, he applied a final surface pass and ran his calibration scanner over the result. The bond reading came back at 94% of the original material density at the repair line, about as good as it was possible to get without access to the source material. He set down the applicator and said, "Come look at this." She came to stand at his shoulder. He tilted the chest piece so the lining hung open and showed her the interior surface under his work light. The repair line, she said. She could see it. At this scale, it was visible as a faint difference in surface texture, hardly anything. It is less visible than I expected. It'll be invisible at any practical distance. He pointed to the area around the old fracture, the undamaged surface. This is the natural interior surface. This is the repair zone. And this, he shifted the light slightly, is what you're checking for. See the way the grain runs here. If a new fracture were developing, the grain alignment would be disturbed here first, before it became visible anywhere else. She looked for a long moment. The disturbance would be visible without specialized equipment. With a standard work light and a magnifying glass. Maybe a jeweler's loupe. He set the chest piece down and found a loupe from the bench drawer, placed it in front of her. Try it on the undamaged section first. Get used to what the normal grain looks like. She took the loupe and bent over the chest piece. He watched her examine the surface with an attention that was methodical and unhurried. She wasn't rushing through this. She was learning it. I see the grain, she said. It has a directional quality like a current. Exactly like that. Now look at the repair zone. She shifted. A pause. The grain runs the same direction in the repair zone, but the texture of the individual elements is different. That's the compound. It will always look slightly different from the source material. That's unavoidable. What you're looking for isn't texture difference, it's disturbance in the directional flow. If you see the grain beginning to run in different directions, or kinking, or losing its regularity, that's the early signal. She set the loupe down. How often should this be checked? Before any high-stress ceremonial or combat use, and annually regardless. He took the loupe back and returned it to the drawer. You'll need to remove the lining each time. It takes about 4 minutes once you know the method. I will add it to my protocol, she said. Not I will consider it. Not I will ask my house armorer. She said it the way a person says something they have already decided. He went back to the repair work, and she returned to her chair. The second unexpected problem arrived at hour 9, and it was worse. The right pauldron's missing section was the obvious damage, and he'd already sourced his closest structural match in stock and was ready to fabricate the fill piece. But when he examined the attachment points where the pauldron connected to the chest piece, the articulation joints that allowed shoulder rotation, he found that 2 of the 4 joint fixtures had internal stress fractures that the ambush hadn't caused. These were older, probably cumulative fatigue damage from extended high-load use. If the pauldron came off the chest piece under load, it would come off at a rotation angle that would expose the upper right shoulder joint. In combat, that was a problem. He set down his tools, sat back, and thought about how to say this. The attachment joints between the right pauldron and the chest piece, he said. 2 of the 4 have internal fatigue fractures. They're not from the ambush. These are cumulative, probably years of accumulation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she came over and he showed her what he'd found under magnification. This is, she said, and then stopped. He waited. This armor has been in my service for 11 years, she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like it was the product of careful management. My house armorer inspected it at each annual ceremony. Annual inspection would catch surface and structural damage visible from outside, he said carefully. Joint fixture fatigue fractures are internal to the fitting housing. You'd need to remove the housing to see them. And the annual inspection does not include housing removal. I don't know your inspection protocol, but if it doesn't include housing removal, it wouldn't have caught these. She stood looking at the magnified image for a moment. He watched her absorb this, not with visible distress, but with the specific stillness of someone who was restructuring their understanding of something they thought they understood. Can you repair these as well? She said. Yes. I'll need to fabricate replacement fixtures. I don't have standard Cathari fittings in stock, but I can machine them to the specifications I can observe here. Another 3 hours, maybe 3.5. He paused. I'll still have margin. What is the function of the 4th joint fixture? I can see that the other 3 are for articulation. The 4th appears to serve a different purpose. He looked at the 4th fixture. It's a locking pin housing. It holds the pauldron in a fixed position when you need the shoulder immobilized. Combat stance application, probably. Yes, a pause. How did you know that? I've seen similar mechanics in human combat armor. The function follows the form. He looked at her. The locking fixture is fine incidentally. No damage. Something happened to her expression that he couldn't quite classify. It was brief, and she controlled it quickly. But he'd been watching people's faces while he worked for long enough to recognize when something had gotten through the managed exterior. You are very thorough, she said. My repairs don't fail, he said. That requires being thorough. He pulled a fabrication template from the shelf and began setting the parameters for machining the replacement fixtures. It would take 40 minutes to run. He could use the time on the chest piece's second compound pass. May I ask you something? She said. Yes. You said your repairs don't fail. Is that a professional claim or a personal one? He considered the distinction she was making. Both, he said. I made that decision early in my career, when I had to take apart a repair I'd done and find out why it had failed after 8 months. The failure was something I should have caught and didn't. After that, I built my process around the assumption that what I'm not finding is more important than what I am finding. What had you missed? Thermal cycling fatigue in the bond line. I hadn't done enough thermal range testing. I'd done the standard protocol, which was designed for the original material, and I'd applied it to the repair compound without adjusting for the fact that the compound behaved differently at temperature extremes. He glanced at the chest piece under the curring frame. The compound I use now, I reformulated myself, specifically to account for that failure mode. She was quiet. Then, you failed once and then modified your entire methodology. Yes. The standard response to a single failure in a professional context would not typically require a complete methodology revision. The standard response is why standard repairs have a failure rate, he said. A pause. She looked at the bench, at his modified tools, at the machining setup he was preparing. How long have you been working independently? 9 years. And in those 9 years, 0 structural failures, 2 cosmetic repairs that didn't hold as long as I'd projected, which I reworked at my own expense. He started the fabrication sequence. I track them. You track your failures. And my near misses. Any time something doesn't perform to my own specification, I log it. He turned to look at her. That's how you know what to look for next time. She looked at him for a long moment. The Cathari maintain a record called the Failure Archive, she said. Every blade sworn who has died in service, the circumstances of the failure, what was not done that might have prevented it. It is considered one of our most important documents. That seems right to me, he said. It is controversial, she said. There are those who argue that cataloging failure is a form of dishonoring the fallen. And you? I read the Failure Archive every year before my certification review, she said. I have since my 3rd year of service. She paused. I think we may have an uncommon methodology in common, Callum Voss. He thought that was probably true. He let the fabrication unit run and went back to the chest piece, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while, and the silence had a quality that he recognized. The kind that develops between two people who have been paying close attention to each other for several hours and have stopped needing to fill it. She left at the 11-hour mark to rest and eat, telling him she would return in 5 hours. He worked steadily through her absence. The station's night cycle shifted the corridor lighting outside the berth to a dim blue-gray, and the ambient noise dropped, recyclers on lower cycle, fewer footsteps on the deck above. He registered these things the way he always registered environmental shifts during a long work session, peripherally, without attaching particular significance to them, his attention staying on the task in front of him. The fabricated joint fixtures came out correctly on the 2nd run. The 1st run he'd rejected because one of the 4 had a microscopic dimensional variance that would have been invisible to anyone else but that he could see in the measurement data, and he'd reset the parameters and run it again. The 2nd run was clean. The pauldron fill piece took longer than he'd estimated, not because the fabrication was difficult, but because he spent extra time on the bonding edge geometry. The original pauldron section's edge wasn't a simple profile. There was a slight curve to it that served a function related to water management and debris deflection, and matching that curve correctly meant the fill piece would behave the same way under field conditions. It added 40 minutes to his timeline and was, he thought, completely worth it. At some point around the 3rd hour of her absence, he realized he was thinking about the conversation rather than the work. This happened occasionally on long sessions. Some part of his attention came untethered from the immediate task and drifted. Usually it drifted toward other projects, materials problems he was working through, specifications he'd been reading. This time it was drifting toward Sarathi Vel. Specifically toward the way she'd looked at his tools laid out on the cleaning cloth, the way she'd examined the hairline fracture interior surface with the loop without being asked to, the Failure Archive she read every year before her certification review. The way she'd said, I will add it to my protocol, not I'll consider it, not perhaps, not my armorer will decide. Just, it will be done. He finished the fill piece, verified the bonding edge profile against his measurements, and set it in the curring frame. She came back exactly on schedule. He'd expected that. She brought 2 containers of something that smelled like strong tea and set one near his workbench without asking. Cathari preparation, she said. It is non-toxic to humans. I have confirmed this. He picked it up and tasted it. Strong, slightly bitter, something underneath that was almost floral. It's good, he said. It is standard to the Bladesworn's travel rations. A pause that had a different quality to it than her earlier silences. I thought you had been working for 11 hours. 14, counting the initial assessment. She sat down again. Does this bother you? The hours? No. He kept working, the compound applicator tracing a precise line along the fabricated fill piece's bonding edge. I get into a particular state when I'm working on something difficult. Time moves differently. The Cathari have a word for that state, she said. The condition of being fully occupied by the demands of the work. We consider it a form of excellence, to be so fit for a task that the task can claim you entirely. What's the word? Veth Sorai, she pronounced it carefully. It translates poorly. The closest equivalent in standard would be something like rightful absorption, but that doesn't capture the sense that it is the work recognizing the worker, not just the worker engaging with the work. He thought about that. I like that framing. Most humans I have encountered in a professional capacity are not in that state. They perform thoroughness. You are simply thorough. A pause. There is a difference that is visible. He didn't answer immediately because he was in a precise stage of the application. When he'd finished the line, he said, "How many human craftspeople have you worked with?" "None before today." A pause. I was not certain it was possible to find one for this task on the station, or that one would take it without requiring access to proprietary information. I asked you only what I needed to know. Yes, she said, you did. The second container of rye tea was gone by the time he moved on to the left vambrace. The lattice deformation in the left vambrace was the most technically interesting of the problems he'd found. The stress channels themselves weren't damaged. The material that carried them was, which meant he needed to restore the channel geometry without disrupting the channels themselves. It was like straightening a bent pipe without disturbing the wire running through it. He explained the challenge to Sarathi because he needed her to understand the margin for error. The channels carry a specific current when the armor is under load, he said. It's one of the things I can measure but can't fully characterize because I don't know the precise function. If I apply correction force at the wrong point or in the wrong direction, I risk disrupting a channel even if I'm not touching it directly. The channels distribute impact force away from high-stress concentration points, she said carefully. He understood she was giving him functional information that was probably at the edge of what she could share. The current is an artifact of the distribution. It's not generated separately. If you see a current reading change significantly during the straightening process, stop immediately. How significantly? More than a 10% deviation from the baseline reading. He set up the continuous monitoring before he started. It took him longer to prepare than to execute the actual correction, nearly 40 minutes of setup for 12 minutes of work. But the monitor stayed flat throughout, and when he was done, the lattice geometry was within the tolerances he'd been targeting. He held the vambrace under his light and looked at it for a moment. This is actually interesting material, he said, not really to her, just thinking aloud. The way the composite integrates the channel structure, the channels aren't embedded in the material, they're part of the material's grain. That's not a manufacturing choice. That's a design philosophy. Yes, she said. She was standing close again, looking at the vambrace. The armor does not carry the channels. The armor is the channels. They grow together. That's why damage to one propagates to the other in ways that look non-intuitive from outside. They're not separate systems. Correct. He set the vambrace down. Your house armorer should know this about the deformation failure mode. The visual inspection won't catch lattice geometry issues. I will tell him, she paused. You are concerned about failures that will not occur before you after you have repaired them. My repairs don't fail, he said again. The point of a repair is to make something as good as it was. That includes knowing enough about it that someone else can maintain it correctly afterward. She was quiet for a long time. He moved on to the final stages of the chest piece, the second pass of bonding compound over the repaired fractures. The Cathari have a practice, she said eventually. When a craftsperson completes a work that will be carried into danger, they are permitted to place a marker on it, a personal mark. Not identification, the mark is concealed. It is a sign that the work was cared for, that the maker regarded the work as worthy of care. He looked over at her. Do you have a marker you want me to apply? No, I was. She paused in a way that seemed uncharacteristic of her. I was explaining why I will know that this work was cared for, even when there is no visible evidence of it. He understood what she was saying. He returned to his work. At the 20-hour mark, he called her to the bench. All three pieces were laid out. The chest piece's fractures were repaired and refinished, the surface so close to the original that only comparison to an undamaged section at close range would show the work. The right pauldron had its missing section filled with the fabricated piece, bonded and finished and load-tested to a force rating he'd calculated from the damage pattern. The attachment joints were new, machined to the specifications of the originals, tested individually before installation. The left vambrace was straight, the lattice geometry confirmed by 3 independent measurements. The hidden hairline fracture in the chest piece's interior surface was repaired, and the lining was back in place. He stepped back and let her look. She stood at the bench for a long time, examining each piece in turn. He watched her hands. She didn't touch until she looked, and when she touched it was carefully, with a deliberate quality to her examination. She checked the articulation joints. She lifted the chest piece and settled it against her free hand, testing the weight distribution. She found the repaired section of the pauldron and ran her thumb along it. The fill section, she said. Yes, different material. Performs identically under load. I ran the calculations against the stress profiles I derived from the undamaged sections. But the color isn't a perfect match, and at close range the surface texture is distinguishable. She looked at the pauldron for a moment. At what range would a knowledgeable observer identify this as a repair? Arm's length, he said. An untrained eye probably not at all. Someone who knows the material, arm's length in good light. She set the pauldron down. She turned and looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him with her full attention in a way that wasn't an assessment of his work or his qualifications. Her gold eyes were direct, and there was something in them that he couldn't quite classify, not because it was alien, but because it was specific, the way some emotions look specific to the person feeling them. Then she smiled. It was not a small expression. The Cathari apparently smiled with their whole face. The amber bronze skin around her eyes shifted, the corners of her mouth moved, and there was a quality to it that was almost startling in its warmth against everything that had come before. I owe you, human, she said. It was a formal statement, he understood, even as she said it, not casual. The Cathari word for debt, he'd learned a few things from the literature he'd read, was a serious concept, not a throwaway. The acknowledgement of debt created an obligation that was considered binding. But she wasn't saying it like a formal statement. She was saying it like something she meant, specifically to him. You paid the materials cost and half the labor rate, he said. The rest we settle when you verify the fit. That was the arrangement. That was the arrangement, she agreed, and I intend to honor it. A pause. But I owe you something that cannot be settled that way. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. You found 3 problems in this armor that my house armorer did not find in 11 years of inspection, she said. A hidden fracture on the interior surface, fatigue damage in the joint fixtures, lattice deformation that would have failed in a hard block. Any one of these could have. She stopped, started again. The formal challenge at tomorrow's ceremony will be directed at me personally. That is not the usual form. I have been told this in advance. The challenger will use a force level at the upper range of ceremonial rules. He considered the implications of what she was describing. If the pauldron attachment had failed, he said, the right shoulder would have been unprotected at the point where the challenger's strike would land. The challenge is 3 exchanges. The first exchange traditionally targets the strong side. And if the chest piece had taken a hard strike in the area of the through fractures, the fractures would have propagated. She looked at the repaired chest piece. The armor would have failed. He picked up the chest piece and turned it over, looking at the interior surface where the hidden fracture had been. He could see the repair now that he knew where it was. No one else would. The ceremony is in 11 hours, he said. You should get some real sleep. I know. She didn't move. Why did you look for the hidden fracture? Your initial scan missed it and you could have proceeded without knowing it was there. Because it was there, he said. Missing it didn't mean it didn't exist. The scan was wrong, so I looked again. Most people, she said, would have been satisfied with the scan. I know, he said. Most repairs fail eventually. She looked at him for a long moment. The Cathari do not trust human craftspeople as a general position, she said. This is considered a reasonable assessment based on available evidence. I know. I sent the armor to you because there was no Cathari armorer on the station and no time to send the pieces home, and I was told that you had a reputation for honest assessment and not guessing. Also a reasonable basis. Yes, she paused. It was not expected to result in this. He wasn't entirely sure what this referred to, so he said, What do you mean? She seemed to consider how to answer. I expected competent repair work, or a clear statement that competent repair was not possible. I expected a professional transaction. Another pause. I did not expect someone who would find the things that were not visible and repair them also. Who would explain the failure modes to me so that I could prevent them again. Who would spend 20 consecutive hours on something that most people would have finished in 15 because there was more to do. She looked at the bench, at the armor. I did not expect to feel, she said carefully, that the work was done by someone who regarded its importance. He was quiet for a moment. It is important, he said. You're going to stand in it for 6 hours and then fight in it. I know, but most people who would repair a piece of armor would not regard it that way. It is work. It is payment. It is done. She met his eyes. You regarded it as though it mattered what happened to the person who would wear it. He didn't have a good answer for that because it was simply true. He had worked on the armor the way he worked on everything, which was with the consistent awareness that quality of repair was quality of outcome for whoever used the repaired thing. He'd never thought of that as unusual until she named it. You should verify the fit, he said. I need to confirm the articulation range before I call it finished. Yes, she said. She put the armor on in the side room off the main berth, which had a privacy screen. He waited at the bench and cleaned his tools. When she came out, she was different, not a different person, but the armor transformed the presentation of the person, the way good armor always did. The repaired chest piece sat correctly. The right pauldron was flush and stable. The left vambrace was straight and clean. The iridescent quality of the Cathari composite caught the berth lighting and threw back a range of deep blues and coppers, and a green that was almost dark enough to be black. She was carrying herself differently too. The armor engaged something in her posture that hadn't been there in traveling clothes, a quality of inhabitation, the way a blade-sworn became blade-sworn when she was in her armor. He went through the articulation checks methodically, full shoulder rotation, elbow and wrist range, torso rotation against the chest piece's fit, impact points on the pauldrons and chest piece and vambrace. She cooperated without comment, moving through each check with exact compliance. Then he stepped back. Try a full defensive posture, hard block position. She shifted into it immediately, both forearms rising with the vambrace in the bracing position he'd seen in Cathari combat footage. He watched the left vambrace particularly. The lattice geometry held. He could see it in the way the material took the load, correctly, evenly, redirecting to the stress channels the way it was designed to do. Full offensive. Strong side forward. She shifted again, weight transferring, right shoulder leading. The pauldron sat exactly as it should. The attachment joints moved smoothly and returned cleanly to seat. Hold that position. He walked around her and looked at the chest piece from every angle. The repaired fractures were invisible. The fill section on the pauldron was, even at arm's length, in good station lighting, with his trained eye looking for it, barely distinguishable. Done, he said. She came out of the stance and turned to face him. In full armor, she was several centimeters taller than he'd realized, the chest piece and pauldrons adding structured height to her frame. Your assessment, she said. It fits correctly. All articulation is in range. The stress channels in the vambrace are distributing load as designed. The attachment joints on the right pauldron seat and return cleanly. I'd stake my work record on it. The second half of your rate, she said. You can transfer it after the ceremony, he said, when you know it held. She looked at him for a moment. That is unusual for a craftsperson. I've told you my repairs don't fail. That's worth demonstrating. She was quiet. Then she said, the Bladesworn do not carry debts lightly. I know. I will tell you what this means, so that you are not uncertain. She stood in full armor in his berth under the work lights, and her gold eyes were completely steady. Bladesworn debt is carried personally until it is answered. It cannot be paid in currency alone. It requires a service or a gift of equivalent weight. I owe you my armor's integrity, which is the same as saying I owe you the capacity to do my duty and possibly more than that. She paused. This is not a small thing. You don't have to frame it that way, he said. I repaired your armor because you brought me a repair problem. That's what I do. I know what you think you did, she said. I'm telling you what it is. He looked at her. She looked at him. The berth was very quiet, the station ambient noise, a distant thrum of recyclers, the faint pressure change from the ventilation cycle. All right, he said. There is a contact protocol for Bladesworn, she said. It is provided when debt is recorded. I will give you the contact information before I leave the station. A pause. And after the ceremony, if the armor performs as you say it will, I will tell you. I'd like to know, he said and meant it. Something in her expression shifted then, not the controlled rearrangement of careful management, but something quieter and more genuine. She looked at the workbench, at his tools laid out on the cleaning cloth, at the black wrapping cloth still folded neatly to one side. 20 hours, she said, for armor that was not yours and a ceremony you have no stake in. The work was interesting, he said honestly. I learned something about the joint fixture design that I wouldn't have learned from a less complicated repair. She looked back at him. The smile was smaller this time, but it was still there, a quality at the corners of her mouth and in the lines around her gold eyes. You are a very strange human, Callum Voss. Probably, he agreed. I mean that as a significant compliment. I know, he said. I took it that way. She stood in his berth in her repaired Cathari armor in the station light, and she looked at him like he was something she was recalibrating her understanding of, and he thought that he had spent 20 hours caring very much about a piece of armor for an alien warrior he hadn't met that morning, and that he didn't regret any of it. She came back to the berth the next morning, 9 hours after she'd left. He was sleeping on the cot he kept for long sessions. He heard her key the door access. He'd given her the code before she left, and he came awake in the particular way of someone who wakes up when he needs to and not before. She was still in her armor. She stood in the doorway of the berth. He sat up. He'd known she would come back, not assumed it, known it, the way you know something when you've paid close enough attention to a person. She'd said she would tell him, and she'd meant it when she said it. The ceremony complete. She came inside and the door slid shut behind her. She set something on the bench, a small case, dark material, Cathari make. The formal challenge was directed at me, as anticipated. The challenger struck at the right shoulder twice and once at the chest. He looked at the armor. Even in the cot-side dim lighting he could see the fresh impact marks, 3 of them, controlled force impacts but real. The right pauldron had 2 and the chest piece had 1. The pauldron attachment held, he said. He could see it from here. Without movement, the plate took the strikes and returned to seat. She looked at him. The chest piece received the 3rd strike directly over the largest repaired fracture. He was up off the cot before he decided to be, moving to the bench light, tilting the chest piece toward it. The impact mark was there, on the repair zone, exactly where the worst of the through fractures had been. The surface finish had a fresh stress mark from the impact. He ran his finger along the fracture line. Intact, the repair had held. The compound had bonded across the full depth of the fracture, and the impact force had distributed correctly through the material without reopening it. He let out a breath. The 3rd exchange, she said from behind him, requires the challenged party to execute an offensive strike sequence. I completed it cleanly. The challenge was resolved. A pause. The ceremony is complete. He turned around. She was standing close, closer than she'd stood at any point during the work, the armor's composite surface catching the bench light. Congratulations, he said, which was inadequate but was true. The work held, she said, as you said it would. She looked at the chest piece in his hands. That strike landed at precisely the point I told you would be critical. If the repair had been insufficient. It held, he said. It held, she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. He set the chest piece back on the bench carefully and looked at the impact marks, 3 of them, exactly where they should be, the armor having done exactly what armor was supposed to do. He felt something that wasn't quite pride, because pride implied the work was about him and the work was about her. It was more like completion. The thing had been done correctly and it had mattered. Your house armorer, he said, when you see him, show him the interior surface check. I intend to. A pause. He will be surprised that a human taught me the method. Will that be a problem? For him, perhaps, not for me. She looked at the chest piece with its 3 fresh impact marks. He will need to understand that his inspection protocol has a gap. That will be a more significant conversation. It will be a better armor, Callum said. Yes, she agreed, it will. He set the chest piece back down on the bench. She was still close and she was still looking at him with those gold eyes that he'd learned over 20 hours had a specific language to them. There was the assessment look, and the consideration look, and the careful management look, and what was in them now was none of those. The contact information, she said. She took a small card from a panel on the left vambrace. There was a hidden compartment there, he noted, that he hadn't identified during his examination, and set it on the bench. Blade-sworn contact is difficult under some circumstances, but I am available on this station until tomorrow's transit window. I'll be here, he said. Yes, she looked at the card and then at him. I told you the debt cannot be settled in currency alone. I intend to settle it properly. This will take more than 1 day. A pause. Likely considerably more than 1 day. He thought about what she was saying and what she wasn't saying, and how much of the difference was his interpretation, and how much was genuine signal. and he decided that 20 hours of learning to read her careful expressions was enough to go on. "I have no particular transit commitments," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then I did not expect to come to this station and find something worth returning to. I didn't expect to spend last night repairing a pauldron attachment joint at 3 in the morning and being genuinely interested in the problem," he said. The smile came back, the full one, the one that changed her whole face. "You repaired the joint at 3 in the morning because you found a fatigue fracture that could have failed under load, and you were not willing to leave it until morning." "That's what I said." "That is what you said," she agreed. And then she picked up the Cathari contact card from the bench and placed it in his hand, and her fingers stayed against his hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary to complete the transfer. "Come and find me when you are rested," she said. "There is a Cathari practice I would like to show you if you are interested. It involves assessment of material integrity. You would find it technically interesting." "I'd be very interested," he said. She went to the door, turned back at the threshold. The amber bronze of her face in the berth light and the armor's iridescent composite and the gold eyes that were not warm in the way human eyes were warm, but were doing something now that accomplished exactly the same thing. "I owe you, human," she said again, and this time it wasn't formal. He watched the door slide closed, and then he stood in his berth at what was probably around 6 in the morning station time, holding a Cathari contact card in his hand, surrounded by his tools and the faint compound smell that meant a good repair, and he thought, this was an interesting repair job. And then he went back to the cot, and he slept very well.